Skateboarding, like other extreme sports, makes for some really interesting video games. I mean, most popular sports are interpreted via the lens of television production. In a way, sports games try to emulate watching football or watching basketball just as much, if not more, than emulating actually playing them.
We'd like to remind you that our game is being presented in part by Snickers.
But skateboarding isn't really televised outside of the X Games, and as a result, developers have focused on the actual act of skateboarding rather than how it's presented. Each new attempt is basically a new type of platformer. They redefine what it means to move through a space in the same way that, say, Portal or Mirror's Edge do. While there were skateboarding games before Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, they often felt segmented or presented an incomplete picture of the sport. California games packaged half-pipe skateboarding with the likes of surfing, frisbee, and hacky sack. Skate or Die was focused exclusively on skating, but still had a really modal gameplay system that broke up half-pipes and street skating. And other games that made use of skateboards tended to be generic platformers like Adventure Island or Bart vs. the Space Mutants, where it was treated more like a power-up than a set of mechanics in its own right. But it was Tony Hawk Pro Skater that was really the first successful attempt to encapsulate skateboarding holistically. It didn't segment vertical skateboard tricks from street skating or present skateboarding as a cute mini-game. Instead, it tried to create a complete system that emulated all aspects of riding a skateboard. Ironically, its closest modern analog isn't really any of the other Tony Hawk games, but EA's Skate. At first, that sounds a little counterintuitive. Tony Hawk is a very arcadey game, and Skate is rather technical, and at least in some ways more realistic. But much like Skate, the original Tony Hawk was very much about finding lines and positioning yourself to take advantage of them. This is before the series introduced manuals or reverts or any of the other ways of keeping your combo aloft once you were back on solid ground. Once you had landed a grind or vert trick, that's it. Combo's over. The result was that you had to know all the routes through the level to keep your combo going without dropping to the ground. Sure, anyone could go up a half pipe and do a kickflip or two, but being able to fly over a ramp while doing tricks, land on a grind rail, then jump off of that down onto another grind rail to finish was how you really got the big points. Knowing the levels and knowing how to trace a line through them for the most points was the most important part of the first game. That's why the first Tony Hawk had downhill slope levels that were dropped in subsequent titles. The original Tony Hawk really emphasized finding lines through space rather than exploration in all directions. In a way, shoving the player down a tube made more sense than asking them to find big lines on an open level. But with the arrival of Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 came the introduction of manuals, and the series began its lifelong obsession with mega-huge player-created combos as a core gameplay conceit. The first game had combos, but they were more about measuring the length of a line or the complexity of a specific grind or vert trick. It was a scoring system designed to give the guy who pulled off 2 kickflips and a 180 melon more points than the guy who pulled off a simple heel flip. But with the advent of manuals, it really became more about chaining entire lines together, rather than just measuring the complexity of a single trick or a single line. In the first game, you had to find ramps that gave you the biggest air, and you had to know the grind rails that had the longest lines to maximize your score. But with manuals, you could string together grind rails at different parts of the map, or finish a grind with a half-pipe trick. Players were still strongly tied to the limitations of the level layouts overall, but now you could do things like find a couple of okay grind rails, chain them together with manuals, and make one awesome line that the level designers never explicitly intended. This minor mechanical change heralded a huge shift in the game's priorities, from directing players through engineered lines to letting them make their own. This push towards exploration and giving players the ability to sculpt their own routes through the game space was continued through to Tony Hawk 3, which introduced reverts as a method of keeping combos alive after going up a half-pipe. After this mechanic was introduced, just about any action could continue a combo. Manuals let you string grinds up into half-pipe tricks, and reverts meant that you could continue the combo once you came back down. This had the effect of freeing up the player to make crazy and inventive combos, but even further reduced the importance of knowing a level's lines. At this point, positioning in a level almost didn't matter unless you were going for the highest of high scores. Some areas were better than others for maximizing combo potential, but even in flat, empty areas where there weren't as many possibilities, you could still manual and revert your way through in one single unending combo. And the result was a system that felt like it had all the tools it needed to fully allow for both exploration and high-score-based competition. Arguably, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 was the high watermark for the franchise, at least mechanically speaking. The game represented Tony Hawk's mechanics both at their most fully formed, and, given the titles to come, also their most pure. Just about every mechanic existed for a reason. They all tied together into a cohesive singular whole. Different mechanics were emphasized by a variety of goals, and the open nature of the game's levels meant that you were always stressing different parts of the system. You know how a song can sound underproduced if it's mixed poorly or if it's overly simplistic, and it can sound overproduced if it has too many concurrent tracks and effects and cute edits? This feels like the video game equivalent of a system hitting that sweet spot, where there wasn't really anything missing or anything that could be cut away. Any fewer movement and chaining mechanics and you're back to tracing level designer-made lines. And it's hard to think of any additional mechanics that would benefit the system. I posit that Tony Hawk 3 is, at least from a raw systems perspective, the aesthetically complete vision of what the series had tried to achieve. But aesthetically complete or not, the franchise was making a ton of money, and Activision being Activision had to run this thing into the ground. And so we arrive at Tony Hawk 4, which serves as a pivotal turning point for the franchise in a lot of ways. First of all, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4 is actually the best the game ever really felt. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 may have had the most cohesive mechanic set, but Tony Hawk 4 refined those mechanics into precision instruments of player expression. Balance meter speeds, grinding rail stickiness, and player animations were all carefully tuned to feel responsive and tight, the way, say, Super Meat Boy or Doom feel. But as wonderfully slick as it felt in your hands, it was also clear they were out of meaningful places to take the core gameplay. Perhaps the most useful of all the newly minted mechanics were spine transfers that allowed you to go up one side of the ramp and down the other, and while that's sort of useful for those who prefer a lot of vertical tricks, I'd argue it really helped the level designers more than the players. They could now place half pipes back to back in small areas to maximize vertical play, or ensure that certain scripted big air transfers could land you in just the right spot regardless of what the physics engine might have otherwise said. But at least that served some purpose. There are also a lot of far less successful additions. Neversoft gave players the ability to skitch on the back of cars, which was kinda cool, but not particularly useful. I mean, it only gave you a little bit more speed than a decent half-pipe drop. The fourth game also introduced flatland tricks, but because manuals and reverts had empowered the player to make lines wherever they want, it was incredibly rare to find yourself stuck in a barren area that forced you to use them. In fact, both sketching and flatland tricks were so separated from the main mechanics they had to introduce missions specifically to force players to use them. I mean, I'm not saying that flatland tricks, or even sketching, aren't necessarily part of a grander skateboarding experience or that they shouldn't be put in a skateboarding game, but I am saying that their implementation in this game, with this emphasis on combos and lines and exploration, feels tacked on and supplementary. These problems were compounded by the new open-world approach to goals. Tony Hawk had always encouraged players to attack whatever objectives interested them, but it did so by giving players a laundry list and a 2-minute timer. In Tony Hawk 3, players could try and get high score objectives while grinding required rails for other objectives while collecting the skate letters for still other objectives. Once you knew the levels, runs in Tony Hawk became timed challenges to see how much of the level you could beat in a single 2-minute heat. And because there were only 9 or so levels total, it was effectively an hour-long game for each skater, meant to be played over and over again to unlock additional characters or levels. But Tony Hawk 4's open world removed the timer and didn't start missions until you manually selected them. Much like Grand Theft Auto, the open world was basically turned into a level selection tool, and once you started a mission, you were given only a fraction of the play area to complete just one specific task. In effect, the levels in Tony Hawk 4 and later are actually much smaller in terms of actual play area, and breaking the missions out into discrete gameplay chunks made each mission modal and separate. In effect, skateboarding games were back to skate or die, with some levels requiring half-pipe play, some requiring manuals, some all about big combos, and others about landing specific tricks. The older games required you to mix all modes of play to complete as many objectives as possible under a time limit, but later Tony Hawk games try to force one playstyle on you one mission at a time. And the result is that all of that elegant interplay of movement mechanics doesn't really matter anymore. But Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4 also signaled the arrival of something else to the formula. Let's back up a bit. Activision and Neversoft always cribbed from popular culture in their attempts to create the Tony Hawk brand. Whether it was the soundtrack selection, or the pro skaters they chose, or the promotional tie-ins they got, there was always an attempt to pull as much as possible from contemporary skater culture as they possibly could. And part of that culture was a trend of recording your sickest stunts or your most awesome bails. It's why early objectives in Tony Hawk were called tapes, and why professional versions of skater videos were included with the games, and why EA's Skate uses a low-angle fisheye lens that emulates the look of these videos. But because handheld cameras were so prevalent in skater culture, there was a habit of recording not only their best skate stuff, but any other stupid or hilarious things they did too, for example, the CKY videos. Now, this was all pre-YouTube. The market for clips of people doing idiotic or offensive things was always there, but had no outlet, so when this stuff came along, it really took off. And so, when Activision went to make Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4, there was one cultural force that had come not only to dominate the skater scene, but had blown up into a cultural force in its own right. That's right, it's 2002 and America's got jackass fever. Now, the game has always had some amount of this snarky irreverence floating around in its DNA, as evidenced by stuff like having to dunk a stuffy Foreman into some water, or impress Neversoft babes on the cruise in Tony Hawk 3.
You'll never be worthy.
But with Tony Hawk 4, you see the series beginning to slip from tongue-in-cheek comedy to outright dude-bra idiocy and asshole-ish creepiness. I mean, in London, a very American pimp will ask you if you want to bet on chick fights between two of his hookers for in-game cash as a minigame.
Yo, these slappers are tough. Pick the winner and win 100. Yep, she's ugly. I'd pick her too.
And elephant poop jokes. Who doesn't love a good elephant poop joke? After Tony Hawk 4, the series would fluctuate on just how offensive and stupid it wanted to be, but it was pretty much always offensive and stupid to some degree from here on out. The first Tony Hawk Underground had an Asian detective who, after asking the player to do some investigatory work for him, had him deliver dry cleaning to his customers. Because casual racism is funny, I guess? By Tony Hawk Underground 2, we had cameos by the Jackass crew, complete with crotch shots and wanton destruction. Regardless, I'm going to gloss over the majority of the remainder of these releases, ostensibly because if I covered every single Tony Hawk game, this would be a 45-minute video, but also because while they each try to do slightly different things, they all suffer from the same fundamental problem. They didn't want to move away from the combo system established in the series' heyday, but they also didn't know what to add to it either. I'll put it this way, Tony Hawk Underground had on-foot stealth sections and car racing sections. In a skateboard game about chaining combos for high scores. The well had truly run dry at this point, and we had 4 more of these games to go. I mean, by the very next game, this was happening. Ultimately, the Tony Hawk games were killed by the same short-sighted Activision business strategy of annual monetization that killed Guitar Hero and will someday claim the Call of Duty franchise. A Tony Hawk game came out on home consoles every year between 1999 and 2007, and eventually people started feeling burnt out spending $60 for content packs for the same mechanics every 12 months, especially as those mechanics became increasingly unfocused. Aside from a few stillborn titles like Ride, the franchise has been more or less dead for the past 5 years, which is why people were really excited when Tony Hawk Pro Skater HD was announced. No open world shtick, no awkward board peripheral gimmicks, minimal jackass stupidity, no stealth sections or driving minigames or pimps selling hoe fights. Just 2 minutes to tear up some awesome lines on your skateboard. The game was returning to its roots, which, no matter how wacky and stupid the rest of the franchise got, were always really strong. And what followed was a lesson on how game feel can be really critically important. The new game feels slower, the trick animations take longer to complete, rotations are slower, the jumps aren't quite as high, the whole thing feels like you're moving through molasses, and that the player is crazy heavy. I don't know if this is to make the mechanics more retro, like the first 2 games the levels came from, or to tone down on how insane the gameplay got later in the series' life, or to try to frame it at least somewhat more realistic in order to compete with Skate. But whatever the reason, I'm not sure the result really works here. It doesn't feel as kinesthetically pleasing to play as titles even just 1 or 2 games ago. The old school feel and the return of downhill levels does imply that they want players to focus on hitting pre-built lines with minimal exploration, but at this point in the series that feels strangely antithetical to why people play Tony Hawk games in the first place. And besides the slowness and sluggishness, there are all these little things about the game feel that hurt the experience. The fact that you ragdoll and go flying around after a bail means the camera often needs to teleport, which is disorienting, and worse in a game with only 2 minutes on the clock, time-consuming. The big drops mechanic makes a comeback, punishing players by forcing a bail if they fall from a large height, which is particularly obnoxious on the LA level. And in the airport level, there's a grindable route through the X-ray conveyor belt that lets you through to the helicopter in Tony Hawk 3, but in Tony Hawk HD, the collision physics prevent it. Even the simple addition of reverts in the DLC feels all wrong. In Tony Hawk 3, you got a satisfying scrape noise. Here it's so quiet that you're not even sure you did it unless you're watching the combo text. All of these are examples of the game systems no longer empowering the player to express themselves in a traversal of the game's spaces, but instead putting up barriers that make expression more difficult. Which is fine, hard games aren't bad. That's basically all Skate is, a really difficult to navigate system where doing simple grinds and combos is really hard, but when you do it you feel an incredible sense of accomplishment. And perhaps ultimately that's the problem with this clunkier, slower Tony Hawk. It doesn't want to work with you to let you express yourself, but neither does it give you any meaningful fulfillment when you pull off the lines it's set up for you. It's easy enough to not be particularly rewarding, yet difficult enough to be frustrating. It feels a lot like the Tony Hawk franchise's version of Sonic 4, a well-intentioned return to roots that simply felt wrong in your hands. And really the 2 franchises mirror one another. Strong core mechanics give way to a lot of goofy friends and losing sight of what mechanics did and didn't work. The only thing that's really missing is a generation-style return to form for Tony Hawk, something that highlights the best of both where the game's been and where it's going. And knowing Activision's love for investing in new and bold directions for games, that's probably not going to happen. Ultimately, some lessons the Tony Hawk franchise teaches us are obvious. That annual releases can cause burnout for both developers and players, that appeasing your audience by putting wacky, offensive monkey cheese in your game is generally a bad idea, and that having a game feel good in your hands can really make or break a title. But I think the real lesson of the Tony Hawk franchise is that game systems can have, not always have, but can have, some sense of aesthetic completion through a cohesive system. Where if anything were to be added, it would be superfluous. But if anything were to be taken away, a core facet of what unified the work would be lost. Games like Tony Hawk 3, Super Hexagon, Doom, Geometry Wars all have systems where just about every mechanic serves a purpose, and they're all important. And those systems stand in stark contrast to games like Magic the Gathering, which is specifically designed to never be complete and is full of mechanical cul-de-sacs and dead ends. Or Minecraft, where mechanics get introduced by the dev team and are reconciled months later when a meaningful use for them is finally found. And while you can intentionally design a system that is messy, or tangled, or never truly complete for a lot of reasons, there's a symmetry and a purity of form to a game that feels whole in the way that Tony Hawk 3 does. And in a medium and an industry so driven by iteration and sequels, I think it's a shame we don't properly recognize or applaud that sort of perfection of form when we see it.